for you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh's hill. It was an awful struggle.
I was the oldest daughter of 7 children, born to Oliver Bliss and Sarah Hightower Hayes. We were all very well educated, as our family was quite affluent. My father was a lawyer and a Presbyterian minister. When I graduated from the Nashville Female Academy at the age of 16, I soon became engaged to a young man by the name of Alfonso Gibbs, but he would die of typhoid before we could marry. It was a few years later before I met the man who would eventually become my husband. My father took a business trip to Gallatin to the Fairview plantation, and he took me with him. While there, I had the absolute audacity to write in the man's guest book, "I like this house, and I have set my cap for its owner." Well, Mr. Franklin, Mr. Isaac Franklin, the owner, was out of town at the time, but it didn't take him long to follow up on my boast once he returned home. It wasn't too long after that before we were married. See, ladies, pays to advertise. Isaac was an incredibly wealthy man, having unfortunately made his original fortune in the slave trade. But he had given up that job long before he met me, or my father would never have allowed me to marry him. It was a brief marriage, but it produced 4 children, 3 daughters and a son who only lived for 13 hours. Like I say, Isaac was a very wealthy man, and we had quite a bit of property. The main property was a plantation, a series of plantations actually, in Angola, Louisiana. And we spent our winters there. That was our winter home. We spent summers at Fairview. On a business trip down there to oversee matters, Isaac suddenly became ill and died there on the plantations. Within 2 weeks of their father's death, our 2 oldest daughters, Victoria and Adelicia, also died. I felt I could no longer stay at Fairview, so I returned to Nashville with my youngest daughter, Emma Franklin. I was a very wealthy widow. When my period of mourning had ended, I was introduced to a young lawyer from Huntsville, Alabama, who would become my second husband. His name was Colonel Joseph Ackland. Joseph, come out and meet our guests.
Well, good evening, everyone. We are delighted to have guests with us this afternoon, and we always did enjoy entertaining. My dear, you're looking lovely tonight. Is that a new dress?
Joseph, I haven't had anything new in 117 years.
Oh, well, yes, well, as Adelicia said, I was a lawyer and was a veteran of the Mexican War, where I earned the rank of colonel, a title that would follow me all the days of my life. In 1853, Adelicia and I, we moved into our newly built summer home, located on a huge estate overlooking the city of Nashville. We named it Belmont, which meant beautiful mountain. Now, I never did care much for the institution of slavery, but it was a fact of life in our world. It was very gratifying, however, when in 1852, Southern Cultivator magazine wrote an article about how well the 750 slaves that resided on those plantations in Louisiana had been treated, housed, and clothed. It really meant a great deal to us.
In 1855 was a very bad year for us. Our twin daughters, Laura and Corinne, died, and my daughter, Emma Franklin, also died that year. We did have 4 children who grew to adulthood. They were Joseph Jr., we called him Boone, William, Claude, and Pauline, our daughter.
In 1861, everything in our world changed when the country went to war. Many of our friends, they never did return back home from battle. On a beautiful Sunday morning in February of 1862, word reached us in church that Fort Donelson over in West Tennessee had fallen, and the Confederate Army was in retreat, headed back south into Nashville. with the U.S. Army in hot pursuit. Now, there was a fear that the Confederates might burn Nashville just to keep the Yankees from occupying it. But with God's blessing, though, that did not happen. But still, there was a fear that Nashville would soon be shut down and sealed off.
We made the decision that that very evening Joseph should leave for Louisiana and oversee the plantations there. I would stay in Nashville with the family and oversee Belmont. By August of 1863, I had had no word from Joseph, and I was beside myself with worry. And I finally received a letter, and things were not well there.
Well, the situation there was so critical. We had had no time, I had had no time to write and tell her what was going on. You see, the Confederate Army, they were threatening now to burn our entire cotton crop, keep the U.S. Army from confiscating it. And I was beginning for the first time to regret my loyalty I'd had to the Confederacy. When I did write Alicia, I told her that I was finished with slave labor, sick of it all, just wanted to come home and be with her and my family.
When a letter, right after the letter arrived, I was informed that Joseph, too, had died on the Louisiana plantations. I didn't have any time to mourn properly. It was left to me, my cousin Sally Carter, and an agent to go to Louisiana and tend to the cotton problem. We sailed there and spent the better part of the next 8 months trying to deal with both armies to get the cotton moved. We were finally able to get it onto a gunboat that ran the U.S. naval blockade of New Orleans and reached the Rothschild family in Liverpool, England, where the cotton sold for $960,000. I came back to Nashville through New York City, which was considered a safer route since Tennessee was in Union hands. When I got back to Belmont, there were Union troops camped all over the estate preparing for the Battle of Nashville, which took place on December 16, 1864. I packed up what household furnishings I could move and my family and went to the home of Mrs. James K. Polk, a longtime friend, who lived in downtown Nashville. Mrs. Polk sent notice to both to the generals of both armies that Mrs. Polk was at home. In other words, don't bother me. We rode out the battle fine and returned to Belmont. When the war ended, naturally, I sailed for England to get my money. We did the grand tour. I took my children with me, and we did England. And then we went to France, where I was presented at the court of Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie. And then it was on to Italy, where I bought statuary. One apiece. There are a bunch of pieces over at the house at Belmont that still reside there. In 1867, I married one more time, this time to a widower, Dr. William Cheatham, a noted psychiatrist of his day. Dr. Cheatham's first wife had died during the war when she was arrested as a spy, suspected of passing troop movements on to General John Hunt Morgan. She was his sister-in-law. We raised their 2 small children at Belmont. In 1855, I left Belmont and Dr. Cheatham and moved with my 3 youngest children to Washington, D.C., where my oldest son had been a member of Congress. In 1887, on a shopping trip to New York City, I died there of pneumonia. My funeral was held at the downtown Presbyterian Church, where I had been a lifelong member. And if you're ever downtown and you hear the bells chime, I hope you'll think of me. I donated those bells to the church.
We thank you for coming tonight. We always enjoyed entertaining guests. We hope we've entertained you with our story tonight. Thank you and good evening.
Take a seat on.
Welcome. I'm Pauline Dunn Lewis. Major Lewis, we have more visitors. Major Lewis will join us in a moment. He does not mean to be rude, but I've learned that if he is working on a problem, not to interrupt him. I believe he's very fortunate to have such a patient wife. Some of you may know Major Lewis is a civil engineer. He is responsible for Nashville having a Parthenon and Union Station. Perhaps he is a genius. He works all through the night. He used to keep me awake, jotting down notes while I was trying to sleep. And then, the only way he could go to sleep was by being rocked in a bed hung from the ceiling on chains. And yes, we did have children. We had 8.
Now, Mrs. Lewis, you must have them convinced I am eccentric. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Major Eugene Kastner Lewis, but I was not a real major. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. It was only a nickname given me by my schoolmates. And some of you seem to be studying on this pyramid right behind me. Yes, I designed this as our final resting place. Of course, you know that the monarchs of Egypt designed these pyramids to preserve their mummified bodies for eternity. Well, I was no monarch, just an engineer with a sense of humor. And of course, I don't need to be preserved for eternity, but let's hope at least until you conclude your visit.
Don't you know our children love their father? When he would tell them stories about the war, it would just come alive in their little minds. But I suppose y'all don't think much about it. But you see, we grew up during the war. When Major Lewis tells them about the Yankees attacking Fort Donelson, they are determined to believe that he was right there fighting as a Confederate soldier. You remember hearing the battle?
Yes, Mrs. Lewis, I do. You see, our family lived near the fort, and when the U.S. Navy invaded the South, we could hear the big guns firing down the river toward them. It seems just like yesterday. When Abe Lincoln called for an invasion of the Confederacy, they started building these huge ironclad ships that were designed to fight in shallow rivers. Well, a few weeks after that, Tennessee voted to secede from the Union. It was at that point that their large navy sailed down the Cumberland River to Fort Donelson, where they were defeated. I recall hearing that our huge guns were firing down at them and were just blasting ships left and right. In fact, one ship had its rudder shot off completely. Another's pilot was killed, and then even the commodore of the fleet was wounded. No one thought that their gunships could be defeated. Cheers echoed all the way down the river valley from the fort, all the way to our home. But the Yankees had a huge army. In fact, they surrounded the fort, and the fort surrendered. After the surrender, the Navy sailed down the Cumberland to the Cumberland Iron Works, where we lived. Now, my father was the manager there, so they took him aboard and they tied him up. After they had tied him up, they made him watch as they blasted his life's work to pieces right before his eyes. I swore that I would kill every one of them. But they told me they would just put me in prison anyway. So my parents pleaded with them that they would send me off to school to Pennsylvania if they would just let me go. So off I went. I'll tell you, I could outfight every one of those boys there at that school. In fact, it was because of my defiant attitude that gave me the nickname of Major. Now, don't you think that's pretty good for a 16-year-old? Mrs. Lewis, I think you recognize that highway.
Yes, I do. The Lebanon Pike was not so wide. I grew up at my grandparents' house, Bel Air, just a few miles out that way. You know, I heard it's still standing, but a new road, Riley Parkway, has destroyed our old plum orchard. My grandparents insisted we live with them. The house was so spacious. After they added the rear wing, it had 30 rooms. I know they would be glad it's still standing, but I wonder if anyone remembers them. My mother's father was William Nickel. He was mayor of Nashville in 1835. While he was mayor, Nashville wasn't the official state capital. It had been Knoxville and Murfreesboro. During his tenure in office, he was responsible for purchasing the biggest hill in Nashville for the capital to be built on, and the state legislature voted and elected to make Nashville the state capital. I remember Grandmother Julia and I used to go into the orchard, and we would pick plums for preserves. Now, her father was Captain Little. He was with George Washington at Yorktown when the British surrendered. She used to say that that was the first revolution, and ours against the Yankees was the second. Maybe if you drive out by Bel Air, you'll remember them sometime.
And if you happen to pass by the Parthenon, I hope you will recall that it was my idea. And after that was completed, we went straight to work on Union Station, and then on the viaducts at Broadway and Church Street. I also pointed out the location of the powder works at Old Hickory during the World War. But Mrs. Lewis passed away in 1903. You know, I worked for the railroad for many years, and when I died in 1917, the train stopped running for 5 minutes in my honor. And I was buried on a cold February day at sunset, just as I had requested. Good evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're happy to have your company. My name is Bird Douglas. Permit me to introduce my wife, Sarah Cragwell Douglas. My first two wives have passed on, but I'm blessed tonight to have my daughter from my second marriage, Miss Ellen Douglas, with us.
Yes, sir. Good evening. We're so glad to have all of you here with us, and several of you even appear to be alive.
Oh, boo-boo, I assure you that they are all alive, and they're here to hear about the old days out on Charlotte Pike in our home, Richland Grove. We've learned that a few of the old houses remain standing here in Nashville, and you Nashvillians must treasure those that do. I'm sorry to hear that Richland Grove has been torn down, but on that spot, St. Anne's Catholic Church and School stand today. A great deal of love and perspiration went into our home out on Richland Grove, at Richland Grove. The bricks were fired right there on the site, and with 375 acres, we had plenty of walnut and oak for timber. I owned from where Richland Creek passed under Charlotte Pike all the way for about a mile back towards town. Have you ever been to Richland Park? That was the prettiest woods. There were deer herds grazing there under big oak and walnut trees, right where the Cone High School and Richland Library stand.
I hope you all do not think we're too proud, but we think we had the finest home on Charlotte Pike. I understand you will meet Adelicia Ackland, and she will go on about Belmont. But that was not the only fine home in Nashville. Our Richland Grove had a beautiful winding staircase in the front entrance hall, and the rooms were 15-foot ceilings on either side. The library had beautiful walnut bookcases, and we had lovely pieces of mahogany furniture on fine carpets and shiny Tennessee hardwood floors. So the Acklands will go on about Belmont and their cotton. But they were not the only ones in Nashville who dealt in cotton. Mr. Douglas and his brother were known as the Cotton Kings.
Now, my dear, you're embarrassing me. Brother Hugh and I did have humble beginnings. Although our father was a doctor, he died when he was 14 and I was only 9. He had accumulated very little and our mother was in a pinch. She was determined, however, that we would have a good education. We lived in Leesburg, Virginia, which is northwest of Washington City. Our closest relative was Uncle William Dixon, down here in Tennessee. Mother must have been quite desperate, for she sent us to Tennessee on foot at that age. I wish I could understand what she hoped to do, but she died and we never saw her again.
Then you give much credit to your uncle.
A noble lesson in life for all of us is to give credit to others, and without Uncle William, we would not have enjoyed nearly as much success as we had. After he saw that we got our education, he set Hugh and I up in a general store in Fayetteville, Tennessee. We did well there, but we saw more opportunity here in Nashville. And it wasn't long before we had our own warehouse building on Market Street on the public square. Unfortunately, just like Richland Grove, our warehouse building is no longer standing. However, that's where your criminal justice center sits now. Our business was brokering cotton. Money followed. When Lincoln sent the Yankees down here to invade our city, we were forced to order the burning and destruction of $4 million worth of cotton so that it could not be captured. That put the quietus on our brokering business. Now maybe some folks, Ms. Ackland, were still selling cotton, but I've always tried to overlook that.
And Father, 3 of your sons fought to defend Tennessee. 2 were killed in the war. Lee at Chickamauga and Joe at Kennesaw Mountain. And when cannonballs hit our house during the Battle of Nashville, we hid in the cellar. But we kept the horse in the attic.
Well, now, I must explain. Towards the end of the war, the Yankees had taken all of the horses. They had stolen circus horses. They had taken the governor's carriage horses. We had one very old horse. One morning, I decided it was time to take some corn over to the mill on Harding Pike, which is where Montgomery Bell Academy is now located. I had a Negro boy with me. His name was Jim, and I had raised Jim from a child. It was not uncommon. Even President Davis and his wife had a Negro boy that they raised. Our own boys had gone off to war. Jim took it upon himself to be my bodyguard. He went everywhere with me. We were headed home from the mill when a Yankee soldier approached me and demanded my horse. Well, I said, surely you would not take a lady's last horse from beneath her body. As Jim and I dragged that sack of corn back, I vowed a vengeance.
It wasn't long before you and Jim got one from the Yankees right outside our house.
That is so true. The Yankees, a few days later, had horses coming down the pike that they had bought from farmers in the country. Jim ran to the front and opened the gate. Some of the horses wandered in to graze on the bluegrass. We looked them over and I found a very, very nice horse. Jim and I enticed him with a bucket of corn and we put a halter on him, and would you believe that I led that horse up the veranda, up the winding staircase, into the attic, where it resided for 6 months.
Thank you, Sarah. Folks, sometime when you pass Richland Park, I hope that you will think of us, or maybe just the horse in our attic. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm Private Ezekiel Biggers, Company C of the 27th Mississippi Infantry. I was born on May 20th, 1820 in York County, South Carolina, the 4th son of William and Cynthia Biggers. We lived on a small farm there, and when I grew to be a young man, I moved out west to the newly opened up Indian lands in Mississippi. There I first settled in Columbus and became a brick mason, and worked on many of the fine homes you'll still see standing down there. It was there that I met and married my beautiful wife, Margaret Ivy. Now we, being from a farm and being family man, worked and saved our money very hard for 3 years until we finally bought our own small farm near Cornersville, Alabama. My brother James and his wife also moved out to Tippah County and settled nearby at Rocky Ford. We used to visit quite often and help one another with the plowing and the harvesting. Our first son, Fonzo, was born in 1852. Our second son, Julian, was born in 1856. Never could a father wish for more from 2 fine young sons as I had. I remember how wonderful it was teaching them to hunt and to ride, to hitch the mule team and help with chores around the farm. I remember we had this squeaky old latch on the front door, and when the boys used to hear me coming home in the evening, they'd hear that latch. They'd come running and knock me down with excitement when I come in. I used to sing a little song to them when they were little. Used to sing, "The mules in the barn and the cows have hay at the end of the long weary day. The sun hangs low in the evening sky as the light slowly fades away. I walk up the path to that little cabin door. Nevermore will I be alone. Listen for that latch on the old front door, 'cause your papa is coming home." I never did fix that old latch, you know. Yeah, those were the happiest times of my life. And then the war came. I enlisted in Company C of the 27th Mississippi Infantry in September of 1861. I made a bet with a bunch of the other fellas there enlisting that the war would be over in 2 or 3 months. So I signed up for 3 years, or the duration of the war. Come to think of it, I never was a betting man after that. I saw many a good man killed, and many more die of dysentery and disease. We were cold and sore and hungry all the time. Hungry. There never was enough to eat. No, the boys quickly learned the finest battlefield loot to be found was a Yankee's full haversack. I remember this one old boy in the regiment. He used to claim that when the Yankees were shooting at us, he'd turn sideways. He said, "I don't intend to give them Yanks much of a target." I worried about Margaret and the boys and how they were getting along without me at home. It was difficult on her, taking care of the boys and the farm all by herself. Now, my brother James helped out all he could with the plowing and the harvesting. But still, my dear Margaret died during the war. My brother James wrote me a letter and told me all about it. He and his wife took my 2 boys in to raise as his own until I returned. But on December 16th, 1864, right here at the Battle of Nashville, I was wounded. Our regiment was in the Confederate line to the far right. We were on a hillside covered with a peach orchard. I believe the land was owned by a family by the name of Overtons. We had repulsed an assault by the U.S. colored troops, but then we discovered that our far left flank had dissolved and crumbled and was falling back. Our unit was ordered to pull back and cover the withdrawal of the army. It was then that I was hit. It felt like I had been kicked by a mule right in the side, and I fell to the ground. I tried to get up, but my legs simply wouldn't work. It was then I looked down at my legs and I realized that my part in this war was over. Oh, the Yanks came along after the battle, and they took me, along with hundreds of others, off to the field hospital. But those doctors didn't give me much chance of living anyhow, considering how much blood I had lost, and also considering my age. I was 44 at the time. I guess they were right, because on January 5th, 1865, I died. And they buried me, along with hundreds of others, over here in Confederate Circle. I never did see my family again, at least not here on this earth. But all that we see and all that we do here is only the first page of the first chapter of the book that never ends. And as I passed from this earth, I thought of that old song I used to sing to the boys. Listen for the latch on that old front door, 'cause your papa's coming home.
Good evening. My name is Mrs. Harriet Maxwell Overton, and I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. It was my custom to entertain in our home, but under the circumstances, well, being deceased, you see, I have not fixed a thing for you. I am very pleased to learn that my home is still standing, and I wish that I could take you all there right now and instruct my servants to set a fine table for you. It is just over yonder, along Franklin Pike, and is called Traveler's Rest. Now, my husband was John Overton, Jr., and we are buried over there, and his parents are buried right here behind you, and I am so delighted to see that their monument is still standing after 171 years. Well, we owe much of our success to my husband's parents. Mr. Overton was a Virginian,
and President Washington appointed him the supervisor of the federal excise tax. But he is best known for founding the city of Memphis, and his partners in that endeavor were Andrew Jackson and General Winchester.
Good evening. Hello. I've just seen General Manny, but I see that you have some company as well.
Well, I suppose they are company. I don't know what they're doing walking through a cemetery in the late afternoon, but they seem most attentive. May I introduce my friend, Mrs. Mary Clare, the wife of Major William Clare.
Good evening. I don't suppose that any of us have met before, as I did pass away in 1911. I was a Hadley before I was married, and our home was over near the Charlotte Turnpike. It is gone now, and what is there presently is the Hadley Park. Our old driveway is now what you might refer to as 28th Avenue North.
Oh, don't be sad, because the good memories of your home are still there.
Yes.
Tell them the story of Major Clare courting you there.
Oh, well, I don't know, I might embarrass some of these gentlemen present by telling them of our little romance. But I will tell you at least that Major Clare did come from Huntsville, Alabama. He came to Nashville and served with Hood as part of the war. We spent many a night in our parlor in front of the fire before the city was evacuated by the Confederacy. And it wasn't until 3 years later, when the Confederates came to liberate us, that I went to Travelers Rest to be able to wait for the army, as I knew they'd be coming up from Franklin. And Major Clare also, knowing that I would be at my house, went there to propose marriage to me, but I was not there. I was standing on the piazza at Travelers Rest, and General Cheatham rode up. Seeing me there, he said, "Miss Hadley, your bird has flown, and he has braved the Yankee rifles to find you at your home." I was quite dismayed, though, in hearing this, as I knew that there were 10,000 Yankees camped out near our land, and that surely he would be killed if he was there. I sent General Cheatham at once to send someone out there to bring him back to us and out of harm's way. In a few short hours, I was reunited with the love of my life. We were able to then prepare for what was coming up shortly, which could not be expected, but the Battle of Nashville was upon us. Major Clare said to me before he left once again, that we're on the eve of a great battle. All is uncertain, although we are very hopeful, and I may be killed, I may be taken prisoner. Please let me carry into this the assurance that you are mine. You must marry me.
And fortunately for all of us, I had some white silk on hand, and we were able to make her a wedding dress in just less than 2 days. We went to the Methodist Church in Brentwood for the wedding, and amidst the miseries of war, she had a glorious one. And with Major Clare came many of our Confederate generals in their finest uniforms. And afterwards, we went back to our home for dinner. We had invited General Hood to make his headquarters in our home. And then Cheatham came by, and Forrest, and all the others, and I had one of the proudest moments of my life, as I presided over dinner for 7 of our Confederate generals. And how quickly things changed in a matter of days. The Battle of Nashville was being fought on our land, and from the porch, we could watch our army fighting to hold our peach orchard. But the line broke further down, and our boys retreated.
So very soon, my noble husband was swept away. I would not see him again till the following summer, after the war was lost, and with it our independence. We were able to, like the Overtons, pull through and get along. I am so glad you have come out to see us here tonight, and do hope that you will visit us very soon at Travelers Rest.
I'm so glad that Travelers Rest is still there, and I hope you all will visit it. Thank you so much, and good evening to you.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Brigadier General James is my father's name. General George Earl Manny at your service. This is not my real resting place. Actually, I'm buried under those 2 cedar trees with the rest of my family, where that white bag is. But I thought this little stage gave me a bit more dramatic appearance this evening. In the past, I've been asked several times what kind of name Manny was, and so I thought I'd begin with a little bit of the history of my family. The Manneys were Huguenots, French Protestants. In the 16th and 17th century, the Catholic government of France persecuted us continuously with unfair laws and acts of intimidation, even going so far as to quarter French troops in Huguenot homes to keep a close eye on us. When they couldn't repress us by force of law, they turned to force of violence. They condemned our churches to demolition, they sacked and burned our villages and our towns, and they massacred unarmed Huguenots all across France. Slowly, resistance in the name of freedom turned to plight and flight in the name of survival. And the Manneys joined the thousands of other Huguenots who fled to England and her American colonies. First, my family went to New York, and then in 1729 to North Carolina, and finally here to Middle Tennessee in 1825, where I was born the following year. Now, I understand my parents' home still stands in downtown Franklin, and you may have heard of the Oakland's mansion in Murfreesboro. That was my uncle's home. Now, my parents were very big on education, and I was sent to the University of Nashville, which later became Peabody College. I graduated in 1845, and when the Mexican War broke out the following year, I enlisted in the volunteers, but was soon transferred as a first lieutenant to the U.S. regulars. Now, after service in the dragoons and in the infantry, when the war was over, I returned to Middle Tennessee in 1848 and left the Army and started a law practice in Nashville. But soon it was the South who was facing unfair laws and acts of intimidation. And when the Tennessee seceded in response to this, we never dreamt how big a price in blood we would have to pay for our demands for fairness and freedom. But tyranny, resistance to tyranny, is a vital part of the Southern nature. And even if we had known the cost that would have been demanded of us, we would have chosen to resist. Now, I entered Confederate service early in 1861 as a junior officer in the Hermitage Guards of the 11th Tennessee Infantry Regiment. In May, I was elected colonel of the 1st Tennessee, and in April of 1862, I was promoted to brigadier after leading the 1st, the 9th, and the 19th Tennessee in their successful assault on the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh. Now, later that year, Braxton Bragg led our army northward into Kentucky towards their capital of Frankfort in 2 wings. Now, each wing won a victory, one at Mumfordville and one at Richmond. But when we reached Frankfort, Bragg got confused, as he was oft wont to do. And he never managed to get our entire army back together again before he ordered us to move out. So when my wing ran into the Yankees at Perryville, there were only 16,000 of us facing 60,000 Yankees. Now, as you might imagine, things got a little heated for us that day. The Yankees were arranged on a hilltop in front of us with their cannon pointing down our throats. Well, Nashville's own General Cheatham was in command, and he wanted to drive those Yankees off that hillside and off the field. So he sent in a Tennessee brigade of General Donelson right head on into those cannon, and they got chewed up pretty badly. Well, he sent in another Tennessee general, A.P. Stewart, right after Donelson, and he got chewed up pretty badly. So Cheatham decided to try to outflank them, and so he sent my brigade into some woods at the end of their line, and we got closer and closer to those Yankees. We got within 300 yards before they saw us, and suddenly they turned their cannon on us and opened fire. Well, those trees around us, they were shattering like they were struck by lightning, and we came pouring out of those woods. Their shells were plowing furrows in that field. Now, the only thing between me and my boys that was left, between my boys and those cannon, was a split rail fence. But instead of charging over that fence, I began lying down behind it, trying to seek cover. Well, I knew that was a death trap, and I spurred my horse forward. But quicker than I can tell you, it was shot out from underneath me. So I drew my sword and I charged forward and ran up and down the line shouting, "Boys, if we're going to die here, we might as well die fighting." And so I began climbing that fence by myself. Well, the boys, they rose up and they charged over that fence behind me and let loose with the rebel yell that would have frozen the heart and the chest of old Scratch himself. Well, we ran over those cannon, and we killed 2 Yankee generals in the process and drove their entire line off that hill. Now you might think Perryville was a great victory. Now we all thought so. In fact, General Cheatham told me that watching my brigade make that charge was the most exciting few moments in his entire life. Well, we thought it was a victory until Bragg ordered our retreat back to Tennessee the next day. Don't even get me started on Braxton Bragg. We don't have the year it would take me to do him justice. Well, I continued to lead my brigade in battle after battle and campaign after campaign. But no matter how badly we hurt the Yankees, they always seemed to gain back stronger and with more men the next day, even as our own ranks grew thinner. Even so, we were determined, my boys were determined to fight to the last man if necessary. But there came a day when we realized that, just as it had to my Huguenot ancestors years before, that continuance to resistance meant not only our failure to win the war, but also meant the very survival of our own homes and our own people. So as hard as it was, I laid down my sword in North Carolina and I came home. Now before the war, Tennessee had been the 6th largest iron producing state in the country. But the Yankees had destroyed all of our furnaces. So what our economy needed was a strong push. So some boys decided that what was the best thing was to build a railroad from Nashville to the Pacific Ocean. So in 1866, the state chartered the Tennessee and Pacific Railroad with me as its president. Now we found that laying track was a bit slower than we thought. It took us a year to reach Stones River in our first major bridge. By 1872, our debt had risen so big we could not make the payments and we were acquired by another railroad. So once again at loose ends, I entered politics. Chester A. Arthur, the president at the time, appointed me as minister to Colombia. I also served posts in Bolivia, in Uruguay, and Paraguay before I met my death in Washington City in 1901. There isn't much to tell after that. I appreciate your kind attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce myself. My name is John Davis. This is my wife, Mrs. Davis.
Good evening. And you're right, Mr. Davis, in calling me Mrs. Davis. It's very customary in our time to refer to each other as Mr. and Mrs. in public. But there are 2 exceptions to this rule.
And what are those 2 exceptions?
Well, I was only 29 years old when you were killed in an accident, and I remarried.
You remarried?
Yes, and even though I know you're very happy for me, I died Mary Kate Patterson Davis, Hill Kyle. I also died in 1931, and I lived to be 93 years old. And I know how excited you are about that. In fact, the houses that we moved into are still standing.
Right.
My house in Laverne, Tennessee is still standing at the end of Fargus Lane, and your house, the Sam Davis home, is open to the public, and it's in Smyrna. But I think that's more in honor of your husband, or your brother Sam.
Yep, most of people, good Tennesseans, know about my younger brother Samuel. We just called him Sam. He was in the Coleman Scouts. And Mary and myself were both in the Scouts as well. And our job was to be able to get information back to our generals to help out the Confederacy. And why don't you tell these folks about what your job was in the Scouts?
Well, okay. Actually, my family was very prominent in Middle Tennessee. We lived out on Nolensville Pike, several miles outside of town. In fact, my father was a very prominent physician in Middle Tennessee, which enabled him to give me a good education in Nashville, except that Mr. Lincoln's invasion interrupted that. And if it hadn't have been for Mr. Lincoln, there would have never been any war, obviously, because we all voted for our really good friend, Mr. John Bell, who ran against Mr. Lincoln. However, he obviously didn't get the presidency. In fact, we really didn't think that the Yankees would ever make it down here. Unfortunately, with the fall of Fort Donelson, the Yankee Navy sailed right up that Cumberland River and brought the Union Army with it. In fact, they ended up occupying Nashville for 3 years. We really didn't think we were ever going to get liberated by our own army, so we had to make things known for ourselves, which was my affiliation with the Coleman Scouts.
One of our scouts, a very brave young man by the name of DeWitt Job. Let me tell you what he would do. He would go down to Nashville, down on Dedrick Street, and he would drink in the taverns there. and he would drink with some of the Yankees and get information from them that would help out the Confederacy. Why, Mary, he left your house on Nolensville Pike one time and headed out towards Nolensville when he was encountered by 15 Yankees. They tried to get information from him, but he wouldn't talk. Those Yankees gouged out his eyes, cut his tongue out, and they drug him by his neck from the back of a horse until he died. Some say you could hear his yells and screams from a mile away.
How could you ever forget that? How could you ever prepare yourself to be invaded by some other place and then have them murder your family and friends? In fact, that's why I decided I wanted to try to do something to help my family and friends. I had my brother, he put a false bottom in my buggy, and I was able to go into Nashville alone, smuggle out medications that was needed so badly by our soldiers, and give it to them. Then I got the bright idea that I could be a little bit braver if my fellow soldiers could be a little bit braver. I was able to convince a servant for a Yankee officer to smuggle some papers for me. I hid those papers in a tree right outside my house in a thicket that was full of trees. There was a hollow there, and the other scouts, along with Sam, were able to hide messages there. That's where I left that very important information for Sam.
My younger brother Sam got that information. He was going to go on a mission down towards Alabama when he was captured at a place called Minor Hill near Pulaski, Tennessee. When captured and standing in front of the Yankee General Grenville Dodge, they said to my brother, they said, "Sam, with the information we found on you, we have enough evidence to convict you of being a spy." But my brother was no spy. He was like us. He was a scout, and he was wearing Confederate uniform. But it didn't matter. They decided to have the trial and convict him and sentence him to hang till death with one exception. They told my brother if he would give up the person's name that gave him the information, that they would let him free. They would give him his gun back, his horse back, and escort back to enemy lines. My brother wouldn't talk, and so they hung him November 27th, 1863. Some people call him the boy hero of the Confederacy. My wife's got a letter that was my brother's last letter that he wrote home to my mother. Would you read it for the people?
I'd be more than honored. Dearest Mother, oh how painful it is to write to you. I have got to die, to be hanged tomorrow by the Federals. Mother, do not grieve for me. I must bid you goodbye forevermore. Mother, I am not afraid to die. Give my love to all. Tell the children all to be good. I wish I could see you all once more. And Father, if you wish to send for my remains, you may have them. They will be at Pulaski. Loving always, your son, Sam.
Can you imagine how my mother felt when she got this letter from my younger brother? It was after that Mary and I were married, and I guess in a way our relationship and marriage helped us get through the death of my younger brother, Sam. By the way, what happened to me?
Well, unfortunately, 2 years after we got married, you were killed in a steamboat accident. You and the commander for the Coleman Scouts actually bought a steamboat together, and they were sailing down the Mississippi River right outside Arkansas when the boiler exploded.
Stay off the Mississippi River.
Thank you very much for coming by. We so enjoyed your company. We don't get many visitors today, but if you get a chance, go by and see the Sam Davis home where we all grew up, and also try to go by the Capitol and see Sam's statue up there on Capitol Hill.
Good evening. How y'all doing there? My name's John Johns. This is my wife, the former Miss Mary Bradford.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out.
Mary and I were childhood sweethearts, and we both grew up down along Granny White Pike. How many of you know how the Granny White Pike was built?
Not many.
Not many. All right, well, here's the secret. It used to be a buffalo trace, and the buffalo would graze along the Harpeth River and then follow the trace up to a salt lick that was near where the state capitol now stands. And I learned that from my grandfather when I was growing up out there in the 1830s.
That's right, and they used to tell us stories about the black bears, too. The bears used to like to eat the cane that once grew so profusely. But right around dusk, they would go up to cabin doors and start scratching for handouts. This scared many of them, just like that. This scared many of the settlers, and gradually the hunters killed them off. The Bears, that is.
Well, our grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War, and as rewards for their service, they were given land grants along what became Granny White Pike.
My grandfathers were of English and Scotch-Irish descent.
What? Irish that drink scotch?
I don't think so. I think you know very well that they were Protestants who settled in Ulster in the northern county of Ireland. They were very independent people with little use for a distant government, whether it be in London or in Washington.
While our grandfather's fight was against London, ours was against Washington. Even as a young boy, I remember Congressman John Bell, who is buried here in Mount Olivet, arguing that the federal government was exceeding their constitutional authority. Well, some things never change. Southerners had to pay tariffs,
Amen.
and those tariffs were used for road and canal projects up north. And I still believe that had he been elected in 1860 instead of Lincoln, there never would have been an invasion of Tennessee.
Well, that may be, but we were appalled to learn there would be an invasion. We quickly accepted the reality and began to prepare. My lady friends and I met at a neighbor's to sew flags in the afternoons, usually at the Overtons. I believe you know their home as Travelers Rest. We presented a flag to the 11th Tennessee Regiment, and it was accepted by General James Rains, who is also buried in the cemetery. Dear, would you read part of his acceptance speech?
Certainly. Let's see what I can find. It's quite a fiery speech. A lot of flowery prose, but I'll synopsis here. He said, the flag was accepted as the sacred badge of an oppressed people's rights. He told his men to defend it with your valor and your lives, defend it for the love of those who gave it, and for the justice of the cause it symbolizes. Let it be the everlasting symbol of a patriotic and holy cause. And he concluded, we will come back in glory, or we will not come again.
That's so lovely. Well, excuse me. General Rains was killed leading his men at the Battle of Murfreesboro. A friend and I had seen him a few weeks prior while we were out visiting. General Bragg was reviewing his troops, and yes, he stood in our wagon as General Rains and the others marched by.
Well, our boys had plenty of courage, but that was not enough to stop the Yankees. By 1864, when the Battle of Nashville was fought, our boys were just about worn out. Part of the Confederate line reached over to Hillsborough Pike near where the Green Hills Village now stands. The Yankees had about 45,000 men up there by late afternoon, and we only had 6,000 to meet them with, so it wasn't much of a fight. And they didn't want to be captured, so they all started running back toward the Granny White Pike.
Well, I was at home that day. Toward dusk, we could hear the sound of gunfire coming closer. I looked out the window and I saw our soldiers running through the yard and streaming down the pike. I saw an officer slap a boy with his sword for running away. It was then that every hope I had for our country began to collapse.
And it was then that my courageous sweetheart ran out from her porch to rally the men. Why, even General Hood himself mentioned her in his reports after the battle, and he said that her name deserves to be enrolled among the heroes of the war, that she implored the men to stand fast in the name of God and country.
Is that all?
Well, yes.
Okay, well, General Hood is very kind indeed, but I believe the real credit belongs to General Cheatham. You see, his men had defeated the Yankees over near the Nolensville Pike that morning, and their timely arrival that evening helped to stabilize our line. Well, later that night, the wounded were brought into the house, and I was asked to help the surgeons. One lieutenant's arm had been destroyed by a cannonball, and I had to assist in the amputation.
The next day was even worse. The Confederate Army was defeated and driven from the field. The Yankees set up some artillery in Mary's family's backyard there, and had our own artillerymen badly outnumbered.
Yes, well, they continued to use the house for a hospital. They managed to destroy every piece of furniture except the piano, which they used for an operating table. The walls and the floors were stained with blood, and of course, the yard was used for a cemetery.
Ah, but did they ride the horses up the stairs?
I don't believe so.
Well, we probably should be going, but you might want to tell them what happened next.
Oh, yes, indeed. John and I were married in 1873.
Right.
We had 2 sons and a daughter. John lived until 1898, and I until 1912. Come back when you can stay.